Good morning. My name is Lande Ajose, and I'm the Vice President and Walter and Esther Hewlett Chair of Understanding
California's Future and Senior Fellow with PPIC. Thank you for joining us today. PPIC is pleased to present this program featuring Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti. I have a few housekeeping items before we jump into our program. First, this event is part of PPIC's 2022 Speakers Series on California's future. As a public charity, PPIC does not take or support positions on any ballot measure or legislation, nor does it support, endorse, or oppose any political parties or candidates for public office. Next, we'd like to thank our sponsors of this series for their underwriting support. These organizations are listed on your screen and on our website. The series is also funded by the PPIC Donor Circle and the PPIC Corporate Circle, groups of individuals and organizations that provide us with generous support. Please consider joining us as a sponsor or donor so that we may continue to make programs like this possible and ensure that they're free to attend. More information is available at ppic.org. And finally, before we begin, if you have a question for Mayor Garcetti, please send an email to the email address on your screen, ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. We would appreciate you including your name and organization along with your question, and we should have at least 15 minutes at the end of our program that we hope to devote to those questions. And now, it is my distinct honor and pleasure to welcome our featured speaker, Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti.
Good morning and great to be with you. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Mayor Garcetti, thank you so much for joining us, and especially thank you for your public service at this critical time for our nation and for our state.
It's my pleasure. Thank you. And I hope I can inspire others, even with the tough challenges we face, for others to follow, especially a next generation that we're going to need to fill spots like Mayor of LA and everything else in America.
Oh, good. Well, we'll definitely touch upon that in this hour. I wanted to start with just a question of reflection, which is, from your vantage point, what are the one or two top issues facing California and Los Angeles? And what does it mean for leaders of large cities to really build a more equitable and more prosperous future?
Well, I think often it's a great question. And I think often those of us that are either policymakers, policy analysts, or policy wonks want to answer that as the title of this organization, public policy, looking at policy. When I think that in some ways policy is driven by even stronger human issues and emotions. And so if I had to single out two, just thinking about that question, what popped into my mind is the idea of belonging and unity, what and who we are in California, I think remains more in flux than it has in a long time. What do we hold together as a state, which I think you can also talk about right now in the United States, even more so as a nation. And then second, I would say our ambition. We kind of feel as a nation, I think sometimes we're beginning to feel as a state, that which defined us, this great ambition, this entrepreneurialism, this kind of lack of friction, of judgment, that allowed anybody to come from anywhere, maybe be lucky enough to be born here, migrate or immigrate here, and really have a limitless horizon. I think that we're beginning to clip our ambition. We're feeling like we're too dense, or our laws are too dense, or our divisions are too intense. So I would say those are the two main things, really defining what will mold us together, and then what will move us forward, that belonging and that ambition that I think have defined, to me, California at her best.
Are there strategies that California mayors, that California electeds can grasp upon to actually address those issues of belonging, to address that issue of ambition?
Absolutely. I think with belonging, which is a word I've always preferred to diversity or inclusion, diversity is a very milquetoast term. Inclusion implies somebody has power and is including you. But belonging is very horizontal and equally shared. The sense of no matter what your political perspective, your ethnic background, your age, your income, that we belong here, that we have an ownership of this democracy in California. So I think first and foremost, it's reminding each other of that. And as a mayor, I try to do that all the time. One of the proudest things that I've led and participated in was initially the Big 10, Big 11. It's now the Big 13 mayors, the 13 most populous cities in California's mayors. And during the pandemic, we were on the phone weekly. We were probably texting each other daily It's the most diverse group of people. I mean, we literally have folks from every ethnic background, different ages, Republicans and independents and Democrats together, north, south, east, west, inland, coastal. And to me, it was an important place to start, because if we can model that, hey, I can talk to Jerry Dyer, the former police chief, Republican mayor of Fresno, as the progressive mayor of coastal Los Angeles, and we can actually both get together on infrastructure, or both suggest to our governor that we have to do something to clean up our freeways, on-ramps and off-ramps, together in a humane way. It opens up a space for us to not just turn on to our cable stations and yell at each other, or watching people yell at each other. On entrepreneurialism, I would say we have to start too about looking at, especially those of us from the Democratic and progressive side that kind of run California, is what can we do to make governance more frictionless? To have many well-intentioned laws, each one a stone that's beautiful on its own, but put too many stones in your backpack and you can't move very nimbly forward. Sometimes resetting that, whether it's our regulations, whether it's our taxes, whether it's our procedures, we have to not just take for granted our amazing people, our incredible geography, and our beautiful weather. We have to compete, and that will require us sometimes resetting the stage in a way that's much more frictionless for entrepreneurs, for people who are looking for opportunity and that California dream.
What are the one or two things that you think are the top things we need to do to reduce that friction?
It's a great question. For me, I think we have to each, I always said that power is an exercise by what we cling onto or show everybody we have, but what we're willing as leaders, at least, to give up. When I became mayor, for instance, the city of LA owned LAX and Van Nuys Airport, but we also owned two airports outside of Los Angeles. One of them was Ontario Airport in the Inland Empire. And for years, the Inland Empire had wanted to own its own airport. And mayor after mayor had said, why would we ever give that up? That's part of our power. But when I became mayor, I sat down with those folks and said, look, I can't give it to you for free, but I'll give it to you for the cheapest fair price so you can have your own destiny. We can reinvest that money. And it was an example of what we gave up. So I think we as Californians have to look at our laws and say, what isn't working anymore? What's outdated? The abuse of CEQA, not getting rid of CEQA, but our California Environmental Quality Act that can be so readily abused so that it costs so much more for us to build things, which means that when we are looking for our sons and daughters to buy a home, or we're hoping to keep or attract a working middle class, there's really no options for home ownership in a city like LA, where home ownership is now lower than in New York City, if you can believe that. So I think it's really looking at those things that are, again, are well-intentioned. And if the pandemic taught me anything, it's that government can change its philosophy sometimes to figure out how to get to yes, rather to enforce the no. Take outdoor dining, for example. There's a million reasons we could have said this doesn't quite meet the letter of some law or regulation, but we didn't want our restaurants to fail. And we enjoyed eating outdoors. And we have better weather here than anywhere else in the world. You go to Europe and it's cold and they're eating outdoors in higher numbers than here in California. And I think that was a subtle shift, but it's an example of if we do that comprehensively with housing and affordable housing, with small businesses and startups, we can really show a way to move forward, because people are going to always want to come and stay in California. Those basics are so strong, but they often leave disillusioned or can't prosper at the level we want them if they stay, because, again, well-intentioned collection over many decades of laws and regulations. Interesting.
You mentioned the pandemic, and I'd love to get your sense of where LA is right now with respect to the pandemic.
We're exhausted, like everybody. We're in a better place. This winter peak was a half to a third, not cases, because we had new peaks, but in terms of hospitalizations, deaths, we're still walking through the next to the shadow of the valley of death right now, when we see 100+ people in my city, my county, die in a single day like we did last week. And somehow that's become normalized, or we don't think about it as hard as we used to. I do. Yeah. I still think about it. I pray on it each night. I pray on it in the morning when I wake up, because I think saving and protecting lives is number one. On the flip side, it's a more optimistic moment. It's a step down with Omicron, so that's less severe and more widespread. But it's still frustrating to see some of the fissures that have been brought out by this pandemic, that we're so divided on basic things like science, information. We live in a free society. We don't trust the information we get or the media. We live in a democracy, but too many of us hate the government. it's a rare thing that other countries don't even have the freedoms we do. And yet they have, in a country where we have these freedoms, a lower level of satisfaction, sometimes even a more depressed attitude. But I am tremendously optimistic. Unemployment, Los Angeles in particular, is outpacing every city in the country on unemployment growth. It's outpacing every big city in the country in terms of our publicly traded companies and their valuation. So both on the business and on the labor side, things are coming up. I think it's a real good time to be a worker, to negotiate somebody's salary, to pick the job that you're passionate about. But I think there's still a little bit of a funk. It's kind of like being at the end of COVID itself. You're pretty healthy, but you still feel a little slow and you still feel a little bit hungover.
I was there a few weeks ago, so yes, I
know
I know
what
what that's like. I know you've had it too. It's interesting you talk about the end of the pandemic, because one of the issues that's been in the news recently is that maybe the state, the nation, Los Angeles is moving from being in a pandemic to an endemic. And I'm wondering what Los Angeles endemic response might look like. I know, you're not Barbara Ferrer, you're not necessarily in charge, but given your partnership with various folks in Los Angeles, what does it mean for LA to have more of an endemic response rather than a pandemic response?
Well, I certainly don't have a degree in public health, but like you and I, who were once honored by Occidental College with honorary doctorates, I think I have an honorary degree now in public health after 100 addresses, thousands of phone calls, and a real deep dive outside of my public work in this into understanding what happens with pandemics, how they end, what their impact is on society, not just recently, but 100 years ago and even 1,000 years ago. Right. I think people come out with a few things. One is that Los Angeles, like all places, will have to sort through a lot of trauma that we've seen and felt. And I think that a city needs to be very open and honest. I always tell people to take care of their mental health, to go back into honor. It was still in the midst, the pandemic wasn't over, but we did a memorial for the pandemic victims towards the end of last year. And we put a flag up in front of Griffith Observatory for every Angelino that we had lost, 27,000 plus flags. And people were just so moved. Those who walked by there was a kid who walked by with his father saying, "Dad, I'm glad you're not one of those flags." So we know still what we have to do when we're exhausted and don't want to get a booster or not sure about vaccinations or don't want to put on another mask. And then for families who have lost, and sometimes lost multiple ones. I talked to one person during this pandemic he owns a mortuary, that's his work. He said, "I've never cried doing this work because I see so many dead people until there was a family where 4 family members died from COVID and I just broke down." So I think we carry trauma, and I think the Los Angeles of the future and all cities, the state, will need to deal with that, whether it's the trauma of lost learning, whether it's the trauma of the suffering. But second, I think we'll also be, like you said, in this endemic kind of steady state. And hopefully we've learned 2 things, public health and generosity. Because we certainly saw the worst of people come out sometimes, in the midst of pandemic, people freak out, right? It's natural. People, I think in medieval times, they take the baron out of the manor house and just kill him, when the Black Plague was on, because they didn't understand why people were dying. Like, I understand why people get angry with leaders at moments like this, because we're the only ones still left talking to you. On the other hand, we also, as leaders, and saw the leadership of our people being so generous to each other, checking on a neighbor who's a senior who, by the way, we'd never knocked on her door in the 15 years we'd lived next to her until the pandemic came. And now you have a relationship that's not just about delivering groceries during the pandemic, but just checking on a neighbor. And I see Los Angeles that's more knitted together, that's closer, that's more generous. And then that last piece, hopefully, that's just more zealous about public health. And there's some real tough walls that are there, some barriers, especially for those who are doubting all the information that they get, who don't want to have a vaccine, or who think that this is a conspiracy. You can't pull off a conspiracy with hundreds of millions of people. But I understand that we're going to still have our work cut out to try to build that unity, to find that generosity, and to get through that trauma.
There have been lots of front lines of this pandemic, and it has had a major impact, as you well know, on schools and students across California. Can you talk a little bit about how you've worked with Los Angeles schools to help support students, certainly including school closures and distance learning, to minimize the learning loss and the effects of that?
Yeah, we tried to, from the beginning, to provide spaces and places for our young people, and now coming out of the pandemic, to support them. The mayor of Los Angeles doesn't directly support the school district, but people have seen me expand after school programs, settle the school strike, get involved in our youth development and gang reduction programs, violence, make public transit free for all students in the city. And so we're building on that. We did during the pandemic. For instance, when schools were closed, we opened up our recreation centers. So children whose parents still had to work, had no place to go, were set up safely with given laptops if they didn't have them and connectivity. Essentially, we showed that schools could be open, by the way, too, which was a frustration of mine, but we had them there for months without large outbreaks in any of our settings. We kept childcare going in public facilities. We really caught the most vulnerable. So, one step up from that, still quite vulnerable, really were left behind. So I thought hard about this. And one of the things we did, I'm actually doing a press conference, officially launching it, even though it's been going for a couple months now, today, is we are paying older siblings to tutor their younger siblings so that you have work for older siblings who need to build resumes, learn about work, catch up themselves, have something to contribute to the family. Younger siblings who've been left behind have a tutor who's geographically close when there's a shortage for teachers right now, and can kind of catch up on any of the learning that they've lost. We made public transit free. One of the reasons behind that was so that students could get to places like our museums, other places where they can learn, like our libraries, free library cards for all of our students. So we're really focused on providing those jobs. We have a youth corps that we've launched, and the state is doing something similar, and we're doing that together for youth to work on things they're passionate about, from racial justice to immigration to climate change to public health, so that you can focus in, especially in a moment when you haven't been around people, on being part of the solution and not just passive bystanders, but empowering our young people to say, you're the authors of this moment, not just of the future, and take it.
Right. Are there other strategies that you all have adopted as a result of the pandemic that you think the state should kind of take on and go statewide with?
Yeah, I think a couple things. One on, I know we're going to get into it later, but on housing and homelessness, we've actually worked really well with the state. We started some of those strategies here of emergency housing, first in all of our recreation centers, then turning to FEMA. I've been calling for 3 or 4 years, maybe longer, for a FEMA level response to homelessness, because no city can solve homelessness on its own. But we really need federal support. And it's a disaster that's already there, but the traditional FEMA model was wait till a bigger disaster hits and people are homeless. Well, I said they're homeless today. Can we do something to make this a national emergency? So opening up hotels and motels that weren't full of tourists or even staycation folks was the next step. And the state took that into something called Project Room Key. We then said, where are we going to take people after that? And now they're being case managed and have food and a shower and they're indoors. So Project Home Key was our ability to buy some of those hotels and motels, vacant apartment buildings or newly built ones, to be able to make those permanent housing for folks that were unhoused. So I'd love to see the state continue. And I was pleased to see in the governor's proposed budget going further, because that's in place for a couple of years. Now they're going to help us with a lot of the strategies we're doing at the encampment level. How do we go from encampment into shelter and homes? It's very contentious work. People are going to criticize you no matter what, but I'm the kind of mayor who likes to run to that fire instead of run away from it, even though most of the causes into and solutions out of homelessness aren't in a city government's hands. I think a city leader can help convene that. And I'd love to see the state go further with that. I'm sure there's a lot of other areas, especially on cleanliness and cleaning up a lot of the trash and litter. I think we kind of let all of our freeways go to pot during the pandemic. Nobody could work. Others said, don't touch anything. But we've got to make our cities, our state look good again, employ young people to do that, maybe formerly unhoused people to do that, and really see a win-win solution that can make us feel bright about our state and our cities once again.
Let's talk about one of the fires you ran headlong into. In terms of thinking about homelessness, I know that there was an ordinance that was signed last year that restricted homelessness in certain areas of the city. Can you talk about what led to that decision and how effective it's been?
Yeah, it's not a new ordinance. It's actually been on the books we've had for a long time, something called 4118, which is, there's two different things. One that says you can't you can't have your things out on the street that block the way, whatever, during the day, but that doesn't prevent somebody from being there at night when they have no place else to go. 4118 limits some places where people could not camp, be at nighttime as well. And I think that was stayed because, or it wasn't enforced because of a series of lawsuits that said you can't humanely tell people they can't sleep someplace if you have no place for them to be. right? You're just moving it from place to place. I 100% agreed with that. The city council updated saying, well, the status quo isn't working. People are dying on the streets. People are overdosing on the streets. People are being assaulted on the streets. And I'm talking about people who are unhoused.
Right.
And the other way of just free for all is obviously not getting people with mental trauma and other things into a safer and better place. We built shelters, not just 1 or 10. We built 27 new shelters that could be stayed in 24/7. We started doing some of the largest tiny home villages when advocates and neighbors started calling for those. We've done a whole book of that on top of 11,000 new permanent housing units that we're building. But the 4118 thing was updated by the council to say, now in places where, for instance, we saw Venice Boardwalk completely taken over, some of our parks completely taken over, in a pandemic where most working class people don't have a backyard and depended on that park as the only place they could recreate or their kids and no longer had that, that if you are able to offer housing and legitimately do that for a set period of time, they want to put in a policy, which I agreed with, that then there is some place we say, okay, this isn't a place you can camp out on, like a park should be free for the people to be able to use, but we won't abandon people who are unhoused in that park. We have to go through a series of things to make sure that they have options. And we've now done that quite successfully in 4 or 5 large places, from Venice to Echo Park, MacArthur Park, not all with the 4118, but the same idea behind it. So now city council members are in the process of saying which areas, whether it's in front of a school or here or there, they think is probably not the best place for an encampment for both those who are encamped and for folks who use those spaces. But I'm going to keep a careful eye as long as I'm mayor, and I think all of us should, making sure it's done in a humane way, that it's not just some sort of stick that's used to move people from neighborhood to neighborhood, and as a rallying call for having the housing that we need in order to actually do it. In other words, now that you can finally say, here's places we can say encampments can't be, that requires you as a council member, as a next mayor, as just everyday residents to find housing and to fund housing so that when an outreach worker goes there, they're not just handing out a toothbrush, they're giving them a pathway to hope.
And so how many people have been moved into this new, into housing as a result of 4118 and the attendant?
None. The 4118 is not, it would be a mistake to see it as a policy for moving people into housing. It's just a limited part of the code that says, if you are going to say this is a place people can't encamp, you need to do and have housing. But we're not waiting to house people for 4118. We've been doing that for the last 8 years. In fact, we've probably housed more people this past year. We estimate it to be at least 24,000 people in shelter or permanent housing by opening up more, building more, and doing more. So it would be a small fraction even when it is used.
Understood. Talk about the other side of housing, which is just housing affordability. And what kinds of things is Los Angeles as a city able to do to promote greater housing affordability that obviously would have some impact for those who are unhoused over the long term, but also just for all other Angelenos who struggle with the cost of housing in California?
That is the most important question I'll be asked in this entire thing. Somebody asked me what are the 3 biggest issues in California and Los Angeles the other day. I said, number 1, housing, number 2, housing, number 3, housing. And you don't have to be unhoused to feel this. The statistic that I said that there are more homeowners in New York City than in Los Angeles now, when you look at the battles, I do have a lot of hope and see things changing. So I'm going to give you the laundry list. 1 is around zoning, 2 is around subsidizing affordable housing or building it, and 3 is about preserving. So we've tried to do all 3. And I'd say 4th is using creativity to figure out new ways to build housing or to situate housing. Zoning, first and foremost. So since I've been mayor, we've tripled the amount of housing being produced every year in Los Angeles. And I've been part of championing really bold goals to meet our state. They're called Regional Housing Needs Assessment, RHNA. It's very controversial because in the past, a decade ago, basically cities could say, oh, I only expect to grow by 29 people in this city. So I need 29 new units of housing. That's all they had to do. Where in reality, that city might have added 1,000 new jobs, but they're depending on a big city like LA or other cities, or I don't know what they're depending on for those new 1,000 workers to somehow be housed, but they're not going to live in that city. And so it was a way of kind of redlining cities out of the obligation to house workers. I think about the west side of Los Angeles. west of the 405 freeway, probably some of the worst traffic in America, there's 1 unit of housing for every 4 jobs.
Wow.
So you can either move 3 out of 4 workers out of there and get housing balance, or you can quadruple the amount of housing. Now, when you say that to somebody on the west side, understandably, they say the traffic's so bad, you're going to actually triple or quadruple the housing. But the flip it to that is like, well, the person at the Starbucks you go to, where are they living? You're stuck in traffic because she or he has to get in and out of the west side every single day. The secretary, and by the way, it's not just folks who are working at the very lowest end. It's like the middle level managers in white collar corporations can't live anywhere close to that. So we have to build more, and we have to accept. I read a great column George Skelton wrote when it was SB 9, something that I actually did not oppose. I was in favor of it, even though I know a lot of people thought that this was a Senate bill that allows single family homes to be cut into 2 properties, and each one of those to have 2 houses. So you'd move 1 into 4 in non-historically preserved neighborhoods. I mean, you go to every great city in the world and everybody's like, well, you're trying to build Manhattan in LA? Of course not. But look at London, look at, Paris, look at, the great cities of the world have sometimes 3 or 4. And by the way, LA does have 4 families living in most neighborhoods in that 1 family household. They're just crammed together without any new parking spaces. It's inhumane the way they live. The garage has been converted into a granny flat, maybe legally, maybe not. So we looked at zoning differently along our transit corridors, making accessory dwelling units easy to do. Again, this was one of the points when I was talking about more frictionless government. It was such a pain to do something in your backyard with that garage or to build what was called an accessory dwelling unit. People didn't do it. Now it's a quarter of our new housing. 50% of it is along transit corridors, where we said, go as high as you can in some cases, as long as you yourself pay for affordable housing.
And are those ADUs being used as permanent housing, or is that Airbnb?
Yes. No, permanent housing.
Okay.
And we actually even have programs that if you'll take somebody who's unhoused, will help pay for some of the costs of building that housing. And then along transit corridors, we're seeing more affordable housing built without any subsidy, because there isn't ever going to be enough subsidy to build enough that we need, simply by saying, okay, you could do a 3-story apartment building, but if you do a 5-story one, we need you to build on your own dime X number of units. If you want to go 6, you got to do X plus 10%, and they have to be extremely low income. The things that were never built, for people coming out of homelessness, people who are at the lowest end of the economic spectrum. So as I said, we've tripled the number. We've more than doubled the amount of affordable units, and that goes into the subsidy. Next is you have to have money, and I hope the state will address this too. LA has stepped up with Prop HHH, the largest ever passed in US history of, this is subsidy for housing. They'll go for folks that were formerly homeless or in danger of being homeless. We need that money to help pencil out what the costs are to build something, and with rents being lower, how they can then make that jump and build much more units for folks that are low income. And then third, we have to use creative ideas. We have to look at the ways that we can change, zoning or building codes to allow prefab, to look at ways that people can cohabitate together and share kitchens, share bathrooms, especially younger folks. The way that other ways of living that we've kind of zoned out, because we all are hanging on to this California dream that everybody is not only going to be able to, but can afford single family housing. And sorry for the long answer, but the last one, preserve what you got. Because if you're just letting stuff come down, every unit you build, if an affordable one's being lost, you're going to lose any momentum forward.
So making progress on our housing also means thinking about other elements of our infrastructure plan. Can you talk a little bit about how LA might use some of the infrastructure dollars that should be coming from the federal government as a part of the big package that was signed last year?
Yes, thank you for that question. I chair actually the infrastructure task force for the U.S. Conference of Mayors and have done for the last 8 years. And I was just in DC last week and I gave kind of my valedictory speech. And I said, not only am I your chair of the infrastructure task force, I finally lived long enough to see it happen. At Infrastructure Week every year in DC, and it meant nothing. We worked hard, Obama administration, Trump administration, now Biden administration, and we finally got the largest economic recovery and infrastructure package in American history passed. And I couldn't be more excited. Everything from our port, which usually ships its dollars to other ports because of federal laws for them to modernize and dig out and train their workforce, but we didn't see it, to our airport, which is the biggest redo of an airport anywhere in the country, $16 billion and counting, to our public transportation, which people know I've been very passionate about. And we passed Measure M, the largest local ballot initiative for transportation infrastructure ×2 in the nation's history. Add to that our water, add to that our energy and electricity. We're going to benefit a lot from this. And we've already had cabinet officials out here saying, you'll get your fair share, it's competitive, but we know Port of LA, supply chain, Long Beach will get its fair share. When you look at climate change, our Department of Water and Power, which I've led, the first really large utility in the country to do this, using our National Renewable Energy Lab, will be at 97% renewable energy is carbon-free by the end of this decade, which gives me chills to even say, because it was so unthinkable even 5 or 10 years ago, and we'll be 100% of the way there by 2035. So we're going to tap a lot of these funds. We're going to accelerate, hopefully, the 15 rapid transit lines that we're building new or extending, leading up to the Olympics in 2028. I think that can be a great accelerant as well. We saw the governor last year put billions in for transportation related to the Olympics, which really means for us, because the Olympics are only 2.5 weeks, but we'll benefit from it. And the last thing I'd say is, don't look at infrastructure in a vacuum. Tie these things together, whether it's making our water 100% recyclable so we can deal with drought and climate change, or whether it's the workforce and hiring locally, like we have done in projects here, where you go to the airport and you see on the line folks who have been unhoused, people come from the foster care system, folks who are women, African Americans who have not been in traditional trades, people who have served time in prison, and they're literally building something in their backyard. The pride, the future that they have, and the strength for our state, we really need to be able to tie in that local hire that makes sure these jobs for infrastructure don't get imported to somebody from outside our areas, but come from people who are our neighbors.
Great. If our audience is watching and you have questions about some of the things the mayor is saying, please feel free to submit questions to ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. So I'd love to pick up again where you just left off and think about the relationship between infrastructure and climate change. You've obviously been very active as a city mayor in climate change. Until last year, you chaired the C40. You've championed the LA's Green New Deal, which is dealing with very, very ambitious goals for reducing carbon emissions. Can you talk about carbon neutrality and what obtaining carbon neutrality would mean for Los Angeles, both environmentally and economically?
Well, there's a lot of jobs in their hills. So I think this work, I always remind people, is good for your economy. In fact, as much as a third to maybe even more of the new jobs that have been created since I've been mayor are green jobs, environmentally related jobs, or direct environmental jobs. But it doesn't mean as much for LA as it means for the world and then LA. It means if we do this, we can inspire states, countries, other cities to do this, and we might have a fighting chance on the biggest issue of our lives. The one that will continue we'll see people die in fires and floods and in heat exhaustion. People die every year from the extreme weather. I think we don't think about as life and death. We think maybe there's some point where the whole world gets so hot we die, but it's happening right now. Like COVID, it takes our most vulnerable. It's seniors without air conditioning who are low income when it gets too hot in the San Fernando Valley. It's obviously fires with homeowners. We see it in floods in our country. We see it around the world. And so I think if LA gets it right, and my whole point in not only chairing C40, which is about the 97 largest global cities, and as the founder of Climate Mayors, which is the US kind of equivalent, where when Donald Trump said he was going to get out of Paris, the only leader in the world to say he was going to withdraw from a climate accord, we rallied over 400 American cities, Democrat, Republican, and independent led, to say if he's out, we're in. And actually, I think went further than we might have even gone had he not laid down that gauntlet. It shows us that also these things are doable. So zero carbon, and we have 5 zeros: zero carbon transportation, electricity, buildings, zero waste, and zero wasted water, which are related to carbon too. We're trying to show that these things aren't as radical as people think, that we shouldn't get as much credit as sometimes we tout, that this should just be the day that this isn't seen as extraordinary is the day that we're on the route to this truly being solutions. I always tell young people, I will reach and give you the most ambitious promise this year I can, but I promise next year I'll look at it again. And if we can accelerate, I'll accelerate even more, because that's what it will take. We're already at 1.2 centigrade raised temperatures, and 1.5 is the breaking point in many ways for our Earth. So, what's that math? Four-fifths of the way there. We're 80% of the way there. And all signs point to that we have to rally everything that we have. So if a huge city like LA can be prosperous, can be safe, can afford to do this. I mean, when we opened the largest solar plant and storage in the country, it was cheaper than building a new gas plant. So when people said, oh, sure, you can do this, but it costs a lot, I said, no, actually, I'm saving you money and helping the environment. We're creating jobs and doing what's right for our earth. So I think it has to be comprehensive. And the last thing I'll say, it can't just be in wealthy neighborhoods, and it can't just be for the well-off. We have to make sure that electric cars, as we've done in LA, putting electric cars, a car share program in our lowest income communities of color first. So people can kind of swipe out a car, drive an electric car where they need to go to, et cetera. The job training, the solar installation, we have to go to those communities that are on the front lines of the climate suffering first. So
what's the one or two things that you think Governor Newsom ought to do that the city of LA has already done?
Help everybody water recycle, I think would be huge. We're going to boost our water by 60% when Hyperion, the big plant south of LAX, instead of washing the water out to the ocean, recycles 100% of that. That's the equivalent of 3 LA aqueducts. So whether it's a Central Valley farmer, whether it's in Northern California, and Northern Californians steal their water too, or whether it's here in Southern California where we steal our water, this will boost ecology and resilience everywhere. Second is, I would say, and it's tougher at the state level to do this, but we have to look at buildings. And I think that I've passed the first green building ordinance in local level in the US for a big city when I was a council member, like 2002 or 3. We did that with government buildings. Then we applied it to regular buildings. Everybody said, no, don't make me do that. Then the building owners a year or two later said, thank you, I'm saving so much money, it was worth it. But getting to zero carbon buildings will be controversial. It will be taking on some status quo. And I'm agnostic about how we do that. It could be electricity. We could be looking at hydrogen as a good way of powering things up. There's a lot of people who have jobs, but we'll create so many more jobs if we have to basically build out every existing building to make them carbon neutral, and then make every new one engineered to do the same. I think those would be the areas that are the biggest bang for the buck for the governor.
Great. I want to switch gears a little bit. I recognize that this spring actually marks the 30th anniversary of the civil unrest in Los Angeles. And I imagine that this was a pretty significant event in the Garcetti household, given your dad's role in the DA's office. I understand he might be watching, so hello, former
Hey,
DA.
Dad.
Hi, Dad. I'm wondering how that seminal event influenced your views on public safety and on policing. What does that mean for your leadership?
Well, so my father wasn't district attorney yet. He had announced that he was running in some place.
He had been in the office. He'd worked in that
Correct,
office.
right.
Yeah.
But he had been a head deputy district attorney, opening up the first unit that actually went after police officers and public officials who had broken the law. And this was the old LAPD. I mean, he tells me stories. He'd come home at night and tell me stories of roll calls he'd go to saying, hey, the DA's office, we're rolling out when there's going to be police shootings and we're going to be doing independent investigations. And some police officer would say, if you were dying in the streets, I'd step over your body and keep going. Like it was such as a kid, that makes an impression on you. But it also showed me in marvelous public servant and human being that my father is, how to keep your wits about you in the midst of people yelling at you and always do the right thing. I missed being here for the unrest by a day because it was my senior year of college. So I witnessed it from a dorm room in New York City, where I'd been very involved in racial justice. I was heading up the National Student Coalition Against Harassment, dealing with racial harassment and speech codes on college campuses around the country, where with fellow Latino students, we had been organizing on immigration, and where I'd later headed up a group that my professor founded, but made me the executive director of Black Men for Anita Hill during the Clarence Thomas hearings. So, racial justice for me was deeply embedded and always has been a kind of a core part of why I've decided to pursue a life of public service. When it comes to public safety, though, I think it said a couple things. One, which informed me last year, or 2 years ago now, almost 2 years ago, the importance of saving lives, of being able to make sure that police officers, National Guard if necessary, that we didn't lose 61 lives or whatever the number, we'll never get an exact number, that we saw happen in the chaos of the unrest and the uprising that happened. Second, it committed me to making sure that we always have better public safety agencies, and I've worked really hard. We brought down, for instance, fatal police shootings in Los Angeles as of 2020. We're 96th out of 100 per capita. And that's hard work to do. It's training, it's body cams, it's preservation of life awards, it's looking at the simple things for accountability when you draw your weapons, et cetera. But it's tough, tough work. But also it taught me, growing up in a law enforcement family, to respect that there are people behind the titles, behind the badges, and that there's people in the community. And my role is to make sure that public safety isn't farmed off to them, that we don't just put everything on the shoulders of a police officer, but that we demand that they have relationships with the community, and that we demand the community have relationships with them, and that we demand the community own public safety outside of the policing bucket too. So I think, that was a lesson that I learned early on that was really important in the midst of the aftermath of George Floyd, to be able to draw from and to say, hey, we're not just waking up to this. It's a lot of people were woke, but were they out of bed? And we were out of bed and on the streets, for a long time, working with our law enforcement agencies, working with our partners, working with former gang members, working with families, working with victims, but also working with folks who have been on the bad end of bad policing to make sure that nobody's excluded and everybody has to co-author that chapter.
That's great. I could ask you a million questions about that, but I'm mindful of the time, and I want to ask a couple of questions about this next phase of Los Angeles history that is coming up. One way or the other, this time next year, there will be a new mayor. And I'm wondering, as you reflect back on your experience, what authority do you think that the mayor's position lacks that you would have benefited from to make the city function more effectively? Where were your wings clipped a little bit?
So I think everybody usually asks mayors, what's your formal power? Are you strong or weak mayor system? And what more formal powers do you need? And I want to dodge the question because I'll answer it too. I mean, I've been in favor of the mayor being in charge of the schools, for instance, even though it's complicated because we have a unified school district. I would love to see more direct responsibility for all sorts of things, from public health to, community colleges. But I also warn people, the more you add to a mayor's office, the less the mayor will be doing that day to day. I mean, I have to run the third busiest airport in the world, the busiest port in the Americas, the largest municipal utility in the United States. And that's just 3 of the 40 departments, right? Policing that we just talked about, fire department, et cetera. And the reason I'll dodge it a little bit is people never ask, what's the informal power you have and how do you exercise that? When I think that that is as big as any of the formal power you have. I call it the 3 C's. You've got your constitutional, or in our case, charter power. That's what you can formally do and kind of what your question is about. And it's immense and it's intense. And I think we've got it's a strong mayor system here in LA. We don't have a city manager. And I'm quite satisfied with the things we're able to do. Second is your coercive power. When you really have to twist people's arms into doing stuff, get the business community to step up on an issue, to care about it, get your people to move forward. But the third C, which is convening power, I think is the most underappreciated, most powerful thing a leader can bring. I'll give you 2 examples. One is LA County is made up of 88 cities, and the County Board of Supervisors and those 87 other mayors traditionally love to hate, or maybe not hate, resent the LA City mayor, because he or she will get 90% of the headlines and we're 40% of the population. The county is immensely important, but the mayor is always like in front of cameras, right? And so I convened all 88 of those mayors quarterly for the first time, saying, what can I do to use my power to help you? When we're bringing the Olympics, can we do some things in your city? What issues are important to you? Because my people work in your city and yours and mine. And so we built a coalition that when I went forward with something like Measure M, the transportation measure that had failed the last time we tried to do it as a county, it went through with one of the strongest votes ever, over 72% vote, because I think we had built those relationships and those friendships. So I would say, don't just focus on your formal power. Look at what you can do informally. And the second time was during the pandemic. You also have informal power that's not just about convening. In this case, I had emergency power, so that was very interesting to use. It was more wartime than peacetime leadership style, making decisions on the spot, going. And I always told people, don't be scared about being first. We were the first city to close down, the first city to go with masks, the first city to have tests, the first city to test unvaccinated, the first city to cut Black deaths to under the represented population when they were double in almost every other city. First city to do all these things. People say, well, what if you screw up? I say, we'll fix it tomorrow. Because you're going to wake up tomorrow and you can still make that happen. So I think that informal space of what you can convince people. I did 100 addresses live on television about this. I was as sick of my voice as I think all my people were. But when I go on a hike and people recognize me, 10 out of 10 people come up, talk to me about it, say, thank you for being there. You're the only thing that got me through. I didn't know what this information was, or I was just lonely. And your voice every single day helped me get through the toughest days of my life. So be aware of your narrative and your informal powers to be a good, nice, caring, loving person, even in the face of criticism. Just keep pushing that forward.
Great. Well, I am getting the high sign that we have many, many questions for you. So let me start with one. And I don't know how many of these, I want to ask my own questions, but I guess I've had a chance to do that. So this came from Laura, who is in Mid-City, Los Angeles. And her question is, how are we keeping our LAUSD students safe during the pandemic, especially with Omicron having been so rampant?
Great question, Laura. And I think that, the LA schools are probably the safest place to be in Omicron. They have done a marvelous job. They got their testing done privately. Actually, a plane that flies every single day to a lab that has robots in it that can churn them out faster than anywhere else. They bought their own supplies for it. And so they've been able to test more kids than almost anywhere in the world. And because of that, when people said, where there's 54,000, I think, or it's maybe 64,000 kids the first day of school back just a couple of weeks ago that Omicron, exactly. And they're not in school. We're able to catch them. The school is actually, it's safer than being home. It's safer than being at the market. It's safer than being at work. It's probably the best regime. And then for those that are sick, we know who they are. And using, LAUSD's kind of reach can make sure they're doing the right thing. They talk to their parents, have those cell numbers and those home numbers that push out the alerts and check on them and can bring tests to them as well. And even feed families as they did marvelously during the pandemic. So nobody's perfect. This is, pandemics are a bloody mess from beginning to end. But that said, I think schools and LAUSD schools are probably the safest place for a young person to be right now.
That's great. From Jonathan in Sacramento, what new information do you hope to learn from research from Big Leap, the guaranteed income pilot that the mayor has joined? And what is the plan for guaranteed income in Los Angeles after the pilot ends?
Yes. Well, thank you, Jonathan. This was a really historic year, and I'm so pleased to be one of the founding dozen mayors, inspired by Michael Tubbs, our former mayor in Stockton, who did the first guaranteed basic income to really launch a movement. I was just in DC. I hope it gets extended, but the child tax credit has cut childhood poverty by 40% in America. Like, let that sink in for a second. Like, for all of us that have been fighting the war on poverty for decades, to have that happen in a single year because we figured out how to trust families, how to spend a little bit extra money. We know that this works. We know that it leads not to people buying more toys or cars. It leads to them having a shift that they can take off so they can help their kid with homework, or they can interview for a new job and do better, or finish that community college or trade degree or whatever it is. So we launched the largest pilot in the country. It's over 3,000 families, over probably 10,000 people strong. We're going to analyze everything that we see. We're going to show that this works. We're going to admit that cities could never afford to do this for all of our people, but hopefully inspire states and particularly the federal government to look at our addiction to poverty and how expensive our addiction to poverty is in America. And that this is a much cheaper way forward. If we can liberate people out of poverty instead of keeping them in poverty with our programs, then I think whether you're, far left progressive, whether you're conservative or middle of the roader, you can see this just makes common sense. And so far the data has shown that in cities like Stockton. We hope LA's will also, but we're not going to prejudge that. And I hope that after I leave as mayor, we'll have at least another year or two to be able to see that through and see the impact. And it lays down the groundwork for all sorts of exciting things, from reparations for African Americans in this country and what it would mean to finally make that promise real. It has, I think, huge impacts in putting together not just basic income, but if you put basic income together with health and educational help, again, could we do 3 to 5 year insertions in poor families that help them break out of poverty? That would be an exciting, I think, outcome. So we're looking at that very closely and joining together with all the other cities doing this at the same time.
Great. A viewer in Monterey Bay asked, prior research from PPIC and other groups have pointed to the risks of sea level rise in terms of water flows in the state and the quality of the water supply. How concerned are you about sea level rise in Los Angeles, and how can the city and our state best address this threat?
I think, we have a rocky coastline, so there's places this is important and big, and And a lot of it is more protected than some of our East Coast and certainly Southern fellow Americans. But places like Venice and other parts of Los Angeles that are low lying, we are very concerned about that. We are thinking about the resilience. We are thinking about what do we need to do. We might have to spend billions of dollars, like New York is looking at seawalls and things like that. So that's why I'm so passionate about trying to keep the temperature rise as low as we can with people around the world. I'm not worried about the water quality. Most of our water comes from higher ground, or will be recycled on high enough ground. Even Hyperion, which is on the beach, is up on a cliff, and sea level won't get up to there. But it's a legit thing. We could lose our beaches. A lot of people who are in coastal areas could lose those homes. And I think that for all of us, you just look at even insurance rates. What is the collective cost of this going to be? And if we aren't putting everything into the climate fight right now, we're all going to pay the price.
Another audience question is, with the new congressional maps, Los Angeles will have one less House seat. What does this mean for political representation for the region?
Well, it means one less, a little bit watering down of that. I mean, it depends how you count Los Angeles. I really look at Los Angeles as 19 million people. If we're honest about a city, there's no farmland between us. It's now a 19 million person metropolis. And by that measure, it's the third largest city in the world economically after Tokyo and basically tied with New York. So I feel good that we'll have plenty of political power. We're, 15th to 17th largest economy in the world if we're independent, in the same way that California brags about being 5th if we're independent. But I think it's very important for us to get back to housing, to allow people to stay here and grow here. I think it's way over-reported that people are fleeing California. Actually, most of our leveling off of growth is people not coming, not people leaving. So that's actually more instructive. What are we going to do to continue to attract people in? Sometimes that's immigration laws, but that's also, I think, just the cost of living. So, I'm more focused on that as a way to kind of restore that California dream than anything else. But it really does come back down to that housing piece. Do we have the will to build enough in this generation? Because it won't take a year or two. It'll take a good 20 years of building for us to say that our kids and our grandkids can still enjoy California.
So there's no doubt that the next mayor of Los Angeles will have to focus on housing. I'm wondering what other advice you might give your successor about how best to lead the metropolis of Los Angeles.
Well, first of all, I would tell her or him, thank you. And are you crazy? Because I told my good friends, all of whom have come to talk to me who are thinking about running, is like, if I'm telling you to run, I probably don't like you. And if I'm telling you not to, I love you. And that's only a little tongue in cheek, but I hope a message for everybody listening, because I won't be the mayor, I'm not trying to whine about myself, is please support your public servants a little bit, even when you disagree with them. And I think most people do, but there's a very vocal minority that just really, there's left and right, but during this pandemic, I kind of said, there's people who abhor human suffering and some who seem to enjoy it. And I think we dehumanize each other. I don't deserve the good dehumanization where people are like, you're amazing, you're so cool, you're the mayor, you're perfect, and they don't really know me. Like, spend some time with me. But I also don't deserve the flip, which is like, you're, the devil, you're a terrible person, I know your motivations. They haven't spent a single day with me. I did a lot of time kind of caring for my fellow mayors, whether it's those state ones that I mentioned, or just communicating with kind of the top 20 cities in the country, because we were all going through that stuff. We were having stuff, our phone numbers were being doxxed, people were visiting us, our homes. I love democracy. Come to my place of work every single day, but our family members were being gone after. And I kind of asked myself, well, who's going to want this job? Because all it takes is like 5 or 10 people to do that for it to sound and feel bad. So I'd say first and foremost, know who you are, and it's not the title of this job. You're Eric Garcetti, you're person X. And at my daughter's school, a kid came up to me and said, you're the mayor of LA. I said, no, that's my job. I'm Maya's daddy. And really, really stay rooted in that. Second, my piece of advice is don't spend all your time in City Hall, and don't spend all your time with the traditional stakeholders. Check in with them, they're important, but talk to real people, because 99% of your city, of this city, Los Angeles, and of this country never gets talked to by anybody. I knocked on doors randomly as mayor, something I've done it since I've been council member. Because it's so important to see that look on people's face when they're like, are you campaigning? You trying to convert me to something? What are you trying? What's your deal? No, I'm here to listen. And so I would say, stay linked. And then you probably asked in terms of what issues. I would just say, stay focused on opportunity and justice, on belonging, on housing. And there's a lot of great things. Don't ever bet against LA. You got the Olympics coming. You got Super Bowl this year. You've got, every year the Academy Awards, the Grammys, the Emmys. You've got Measure M building 15 rail lines. You've got the airport going to have a people mover open. You can have recycled water, 100% renewable energy. Like, you just have to sit at this desk and it's going to be a good job, let alone what you want to bring to it. So love that fun part, because the stress part is going to be there every day.
So thinking back to that, what are you most proud of that you did as mayor when you think about your tenure? And where do you think you or wish you'd made more progress?
I don't live life with a lot of regret or guilt, and I try not to live it with a lot of pride either. I'm really happy that we all collectively stepped up to pass HHH&M, so that homelessness was brought to something that's all of our responsibility, and to deal with traffic. And I knew both of those would way outlast. People wouldn't see the results while I was mayor, but I come to wonder, like, what weren't we doing 20, 30 years ago? Why isn't there public transportation at LAX? Like, somebody's got to do the work that results in those things later, those investments, and bring the Olympics, because I remember what it did for our social cohesion in 1984. It was just beautiful. And if you can get money ahead of time, you can expand a Black kid or a brown kid's opportunities to play a sport that he or she never thought they would, and maybe even medal in their own backyard. Like, invest in people's dreams, and you can have some pride that we did that together. And I think the only thing I'm kind of proud about is just that I got the chance to lead the city that I love. And I can't wait for the best title after daddy and husband is Angelino. And I'll always be that, even as this next job takes me away overseas. No matter where I live, I will always come back here. This will be home. And I can't wait to be a private citizen Angelino one day, calling my representatives, calling the next mayor saying, hey, I need some help with that pothole. Let's build a park. Let's get engaged when my grandkids need X, Y, and Z, and just be a good, engaged, involved citizen.
That's awesome. So my role
Here at PPIC is to think about the future. And I'm curious, what gives you hope about the future of California?
I think that underneath everything, even in our toughest days, I call Los Angeles, but it applies to California too, an imperfect paradise. We've got, you drive for 2 minutes inside a city and go or explore every restaurant in a mini mall, or go see some poppies at the right time of year, and you're going to be like, how did I win the lottery to live here?
Right
to see
on.
cultures and people and weather and beauty, ocean, mountains, forest, desert. Like, the world is right here, and that always gives me hope. That's the well from which I drink. But second, so too are the people. I mean, I think that we figure it out. We're a stubborn, hardworking people that underneath it all, I think, really do lead with love. Not always. I'm not naive. I always talk about leading with love. I know that's not the only emotion people have. I've certainly witnessed that, and the pandemic brings stresses out. But I think Californians, if we get it right, will become more communitarian with one another, because we really used to be libertarian. Build me my freeway, steal me my water, we'll take care of the rest. That works when it's a frontier mentality and there's a lot of open space. But remember, this land was none of ours originally, except for the native peoples. Remember that people came here in different stories, some pushed, some pulled. But if we can find what unites us, find that commonality between us and across the state, I mean, the whole world's as stressed as we are, but we've got California and we've got Californians. And that gives me hope.
We have reached the end of our program. Mayor Garcetti, I am so grateful to have been with you today. Thank you so much for having joined me. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, Lande. It was great to be with you.
I would like to again thank our sponsors, and I would like to thank all of you for joining us online today. If you pre-registered for today's event, later today you will receive a survey, and we hope you'll take a couple of minutes to let us know how you think we did. Thank you again for joining us. Please be safe today and have a good day.